Hello, welcome to tonight's edition of History with Mr. Simpson in his living room. I'm glad you tuned in for the day. So far, we have looked at a few things of the interwar years, and particularly the economic problems, the social impact and results of World War I in a very disillusioned age, problems associated with the Treaty of Versailles and new boundaries, and the failed League of Nations, which you all should realize is a precursor to the United Nations, which exists today. Our focus shifts or moves towards the inevitable, the rise of what's called totalitarian dictatorships. There are three in particular that we are interested in following and understanding and hoping to learn from so that history does not repeat itself in such a manner. The first is in fascist Italy. They're known as the Black Shirts. Then we will look at Russia, communist Russia, and that's known as the Reds. And we will then see Nazi Germany, and they're known as the Brown Shirts. For one reason or another, the history of this era takes on three distinct colors: black, red, and brown. And you can remember it that way. We've studied the rise of governments in a number of different countries throughout our course so far in this Western civilization. And one of the things we noted was that as single families were able to organize themselves throughout the medieval period as leaders of factions of nobility and found ways to collect taxes in an efficient manner and build a bureaucracy, they were able to fund standing armies. And we noticed that these particular early monarchies rose and gave birth to the seeds of the modern nation state, be it England, France, Germany, or Russia today. Now, in this particular case, we might look at a place like Versailles and Louis XIV and understand that in his age, we call that the absolutism of the age. He was an absolutist king. He had royal absolutism, that is, divine right, the belief that God had selected the Bourbons as the monarchies of France. In that particular case, we say absolutism. Absolute as in the total authority of government, economics, judicial law, all controlled by the monarchy. And we also learned that in the Age of Enlightenment and after the Revolutionary period, the West came to see it wiser to separate the powers of government into three distinct branches. Can you guess them? Legislative, executive, and judicial. Now, there still remained monarchies throughout the 19th century. We didn't get a chance to study a lot of that history, but what came to be in the early 20th century was an attack on the rise of liberal democratic systems that rose in the 18th, 19th century as a result of the Enlightenment. And after World War I, many felt that the promises of democracy and representative government were bad promises. In other words, what we had hoped to be rule by the people in a modern era, some felt led to the catastrophes of modern warfare. That's a lot to unpack in that statement, and I don't expect you to fully understand that. But I think you can understand that there were people that feared that people couldn't rule themselves, that we were not smart enough or not educated enough, or could be easily manipulated into believing something that wasn't true. So the monarchists of the 19th century continued to argue that the royal families of Europe were better prepared and better schooled in ruling, and that was their proper role, and then all the rest of us should follow. Well, World War I certainly didn't make the case for liberal democracy. At any rate, after the war, in trying economic times, in an age of disillusionment, where a whole generation of young men lay dead in the battlefields, there were people that were said, it's time to readdress this and to move into a new order. And those are the people that believed that a totalitarian state ruled by a person of personality, a person of charisma, a capable person, they call it the cult of personality. But a state ruled by a person with total authority would be a more efficient place than a messy democratic state where little political factions argue about what direction to go. Should we do this? Should we do that? They want a straw man that says, do this, and it's done. So the appeal of a person with total authority existed in these post-war years. Not only that, but the idea of totalitarianism, this is total control of the government, way unlike what Louis XIV and the absolutists had. When we said absolutism, we meant the conjoining of legislative, executive, and judicial. We go beyond that in the totalitarian state. In the totalitarian state, they control transportation systems, public education systems, mass communication systems, the economy, factories, and obviously the other aspects of government, taxation, and rules and laws and legislation. So all that stuff plus a much deeper interference in the personal lives of the people. Louis XIV didn't have control over what his peasants did day to day per se, but a modern dictator can tell those peasants where to send their children to school and can write the curriculum for those children to learn and can control whatever mass communication, be it TVs, movies, newspapers, or internet, that those children have access to. And by controlling the information and by controlling the educational systems, by controlling the economy, people can be shaped into an ideal that that totalitarian dictator hopes to achieve. And that is the story of the 1920s and 1930s. You saw how Benito Mussolini, you've read anyway, and saw a short clip, how the Italians emerged from World War I very, very disheartened and very depressed and very confused. And they turned to Benito Mussolini as a strongman, Il Duce, that could lead them to a better world. And this was the ideal of fascism. It was a political party that Benito Mussolini founded. And the other aspect of that, we take the idea of totalitarian dictatorship and now we merge it with an ideology. In the fascist ideology, it's rampant and intense nationalism, the greatness of one people over other peoples. Obviously, in the case of Mussolini, it's the history of Italy, the age of the ancient Roman Republic and the Renaissance and all of that. He's extolling the virtues of the Italian past and saying the Italians can be great again, and rallies people around that historical, hopeful dream of superiority. So it's, when we say fascism, we go a step further. I'm not necessarily talking about the totalitarian dictatorship. I'm talking about the anti-democratic, the anti-liberal, the rampant nationalist ideology of that. This certainly applies to the more important, I guess I'll say, fascist totalitarian dictatorship of the early 20th century, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. Before we get there, we need to go to Russia. Russia it turns into a totalitarian dictatorship, but for much, much different reasons. Yeah, there's aspects of nationalistic glory, but not in any way, shape, or form of the Nazis or the fascists had. The Russians, led by first Vladimir Lenin and then Joseph Stalin, had a socioeconomic ideology steeped in the philosophies of Karl Marx and the belief that revolution by the working class over the power elite was the only road to a better future. And the ideology of communism drove the growth of a totalitarian dictatorship in Russia. So you're beginning to learn about that. I will talk more about that as we go on. We'll have a live synchronous discussion, and I'll make for you another asynchronous film. But I wanted to drop in on you and just talk about this idea of what totalitarian dictatorship is. It's total control over the lives of people, way different than absolutist royal monarchies of the 16th, 17th, or 18th century. And then there's another component to it. What is the ideology driving that particular political system? And it varies. It's going to be rampant nationalism and anti-democratic liberalism, or it's going to be the dreams of a communist state. But ultimately, it ends up being the same thing, a very egotistical, very manipulative, very controlling, very evil in many cases leader that is out for, it's tough to say, it's out for power. Let's just leave it there today. I think that's enough for today. Thank you for dropping in on my living room for the evening, and if you don't mind, I think I'll return to my fire. A fire in May, really? Have a good night.